It was a routine test aboard USS Iowa, and everything seemed to follow standard procedure at first. Inside Turret 2, the massive 16-inch guns were being prepared to fire. Their crews working with the practiced discipline expected of such a dangerous job. The right gun was reported loaded without incident, and only seconds later, the left gun followed suit. But then, a problem arose in the center gun, something that immediately felt wrong to the men inside the turret. Over the turret's phone circuit, a voice came through, crackling with tension. "We have a problem here. We are not ready yet. We have a problem here." Despite this warning, preparations continued as if nothing were seriously amiss, a decision that would prove catastrophic. What had started as a routine drill quickly spiraled into confusion. The crew of Turret 2 worked frantically to resolve the issue, but warning signs only multiplied as each second passed. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and then came a final, desperate cry through the communication system. "Oh my God, the powder is smoldering." At that moment, the terrible truth became clear. A powerful and deadly experiment was about to go disastrously wrong. This disaster had its roots long before that day. On March 10, 1988, after returning from deployment in the Persian Gulf, USS Iowa docked in Norfolk, Virginia for maintenance. The battleship was worn, her systems strained by years of service. By late May, newly appointed Captain Fred Musully made a critical choice that would set the stage for tragedy. A $1 million repair package had been planned for Iowa's massive main gun batteries. But Musully cancelled it, choosing instead to spend the funds overhauling the ship's power plant. This decision left 75 critical deficiencies in the guns unaddressed, problems that were well documented but ignored. For a time, these issues remained dormant, not immediately crippling the ship. But their weight hung heavily in the background. Iowa sailed on sea trials in the Chesapeake Bay, then moved on to refresher training exercises in Florida and Puerto Rico. Yet from September 1988 until the end of that year, the gun crews received minimal training, and the big guns continued to show troubling maintenance issues that no one fully confronted. Ensign Don Mayer, officer in charge of Turret 1, later described how the situation steadily eroded morale among the crew. In January 1989, two senior officers, Master Chief Fire Controlman Stephen Skelly and Gunnery Officer Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Michael Costigan, introduced a controversial experimental plan designed to extend the range of Iowa's guns. The idea was to use supercharged powder bags in combination with specially designed shells, pushing the 16-inch guns beyond their standard limits. Many on board believed the plan was reckless and dangerous. The turrets were old, worn, and plagued by mechanical failures. Mayer and others were vocal in their opposition. Nevertheless, Captain Musully was led to believe the experiments had been approved. But the supposed authorization came not from a high-ranking naval authority, but from a civilian employee at the Naval Sea Systems Command, Safety Officerman, who had no power to grant such approval. Worse, this fact was concealed from higher command, and so the experiments continued unchecked. On January 20, 1989, off VX Island, Turret 1 fired 6 experimental shells using the new powder bags. One shell flew 23.4 nautical miles, a record distance for a conventional 16-inch round. But the achievement brought little pride to the men who witnessed it. Mayor and Petty Officer, First Class Dale Mortensen, Gun Chief for Turret 1, were disturbed enough that they refused to take part in further experiments. Skelly then turned to Turret 2, where Senior Chief Reggie Ziegler at first refused to allow such testing. Under pressure, however, Ziegler's superior reluctantly gave in, and the dangerous experiments spread. A week later, another perilous episode occurred when Iowa's new executive officer ordered a main battery drill against the warnings of the gunnery crews. Turrets 1 and 2 fired at a dangerous 15 offset, forcing one of Turret 2's guns to fire directly over Turret 1. During loading, a powder bag began to smolder, a moment away from a chain reaction disaster. Only quick action by the gun captain, who slammed the breech block shut just in time, prevented the round from firing on its own. The resulting concussion was still devastating. It tore apart turret ones, gun bloomers, wrecked its electrical systems, and left stunned crewmen scrambling through darkness and smoke. Mayer later described the chaos. The shockwave blew out the turret officer switchboard. We had no power, no lights for a time. Men were screaming. There was panic. From that point forward, morale plummeted. The crews knew the danger they were in, and many began to openly question what was happening. Gunner's mate, 3rd Class Scott Blakey, was one of those men. He expressed his fears plainly. We shouldn't be doing them. Something could go wrong. But when asked why, they continued. His only answer was chilling. We don't have a choice. Despite repeated warnings, the ship pressed ahead. For an upcoming fleet exercise, the crew would be tasked with firing 2,700-pound shells using outdated powder, designed for much lighter projectiles. The sailors had received no training for loading the non-standard 5-bag charges. Meanwhile, the rammerman, the man responsible for pushing the powder into the breach, was working under conditions that lacked any safety mechanism to prevent disaster if something went wrong. The danger was escalating with every step, and the men of Iowa's turrets knew it. Yet they carried on, bound by orders and duty, unaware of how close they stood to catastrophe. On April 19, 1989, the final disaster struck. At 8:31 a.m., the order came for the crew to take stations in the ship's main turrets. By 9:03, all 3 turrets were reported manned and ready for a standard firing drill. At 9:33, Turret 1 fired, but the left gun misfired, and the problem could not be fixed. Captain Muesli then ordered Turret 2 fire a 3-gun salvo, bypassing Turret 1 entirely. Turret 2's crew set to work. The right gun was reported ready after 44 seconds, followed soon after by the left gun, but in the center gun room, trouble emerged again. Eric Lawrence radioed Ziegler urgently. We have a problem here. We are not ready yet. Ziegler, perhaps trying to keep the crew calm, responded with reassurance. Left gun loaded. Good job, center guns, having a little trouble. We'll straighten that out. But Lawrence repeated his words, more insistent this time. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. Then, the intercom erupted with panic as Ernie Hootnitz, Turret 2's leading petty officer, shouted with urgency, Mort, Mort, Mort. Ziegler saw what was happening. The powder inside the center gun was beginning to smolder. He opened the rear turret door to check the situation, while yelling for the crew to close the breach. Hootnitz's final cry chilled everyone. Oh my God, there's a flash. Just 81 seconds after Captain Musali's order to load, the center gun of Turret 2 exploded. A fireball hotter than 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit blasted outward at 2,000 feet per second. Bulkheads crumpled under the force. Doors were blown apart. And all 3 gunrooms filled instantly with fire and toxic cyanide gas. Inside, 2,000 pounds of powder bags ignited, turning the turret into a blazing inferno. The devastation was total, but it did not end there. 9 minutes later, another explosion shook the ship, likely caused by carbon monoxide igniting. The disaster that many had feared had finally come to pass, and it left the crew of USS Iowa stunned, broken, and grieving, knowing that their warnings and fears had all come true in the most tragic way possible. Steel warped and twisted under the immense pressure of the blast. Smoke poured into the corridors, and emergency crews scrambled desperately to fight the fire and rescue their shipmates. But it was already too late. 47 men were trapped inside the shattered turret, their fates sealed in an instant. None survived. Below, in the magazine, 12 sailors narrowly escaped death when the blast doors miraculously held, protecting them from the firestorm above. Yet above, Turret 2 was reduced to a blackened husk, its once mighty guns silenced forever. A battleship designed for war, built to endure the fiercest combat, had instead been torn apart by destruction from within. A disaster that came not from enemy shells but from its own heart. The inferno raged for an hour and a half before it was finally extinguished through relentless and heroic efforts by the damage control teams. When the fire was out, investigators entered the ruins. Among the twisted metal and scorched remains, Petty Officer Dale Mortensen found the lifeless body of gunner's mate 2nd Class Clayton Hartwig, lying at the bottom of the center gun pit. Mortensen also noticed something unusual. The powder hoist had not been lowered, a detail that immediately struck him as out of place. As the crew tried to process the loss of their comrades, the official investigation began. Operations Specialist First Class James Drake from USS Coral Sea, trained in ordnance disposal, was brought in to inspect the scene. After examining the remains of the center gunroom, Drake suggested the explosion had likely been triggered when powder bags were rammed too quickly and compressed against the 16-inch projectile. The possibility of improper procedure was further supported when Turret 1's left gun was inspected, revealing a powder bag that had been loaded sideways, an unmistakable sign of sloppy or rushed work. But instead of treating the turret as a crime scene, higher authorities ordered a cleanup crew to restore it to a semblance of normalcy. Damaged gear was unceremoniously thrown overboard, evidence lost forever to the ocean. One firefighter later recalled with bitterness, "No one was preserving the evidence." Captain Fred Musali, meanwhile, held private meetings with his officers, urging them to limit their statements to investigators, a move that would later be viewed as an attempt to shape testimony and suppress damaging details, further fueling suspicions that a cover-up was underway. On April 23, USS Iowa returned to Norfolk, where a solemn memorial service was held for the 47 lost men. President George H.W. Bush attended, delivering a heartfelt speech in which he promised the families that the government would uncover the truth behind the tragedy. "We will find out why this happened," he vowed. During a press conference, Musali insisted the crew of Turret 2 were all fully qualified. But even as the memorial wreaths floated on the water, troubling new details began to surface. It was revealed that Clayton Hartwig had recently taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy, naming his close friend and superior, Kendall Truitt, as the sole beneficiary. Hartwig's family was stunned, questioning whether the money would ever reach them. And soon rumors began circulating of a secret romantic relationship between Hartwig and Truitt. Though never substantiated, the suggestion of a hidden affair was eagerly seized upon, pushing Hartwig into the center of the investigation and painting him as a man with hidden motives. The Navy quickly seized upon Hartwig as the easiest scapegoat. Commodore Richard D. Milligan was appointed to lead the inquiry, but his investigation began within hours of the blast and lacked the structure and rigor of a formal tribunal. Witnesses were not placed under oath, crucial details were overlooked, and Hartwig, being dead, could not defend himself. When Ensign Dan Mayer tried to raise the issue of the experimental gunnery drills that had plagued Iowa in the months before the explosion, Milligan's chief of staff silenced him with an aggressive warning. Other witnesses later discovered that portions of their statements had been edited, altered, or omitted entirely, twisting the narrative in favor of a single conclusion. By May, leaks to the press began shaping public opinion. Newspapers and television outlets hinted that Hartwig was a troubled sailor with personal grievances. The Naval Investigative Service interviewed his friends and family, searching desperately for evidence of motive, but turned up little more than rumors and speculation. Even so, stories began circulating in the Washington Post and on NBC News that Hartwig had deliberately caused the explosion, fueled by the discovery of a book in his locker that the media claimed was a bomb-making manual. Though the book was nothing of the sort, the press framed it as proof of sabotage. The FBI bolstered this narrative by issuing its own conclusion that Hartwig had orchestrated the blast in a way that would look like an accident, a claim that ignored mounting technical evidence of systemic failures within the turrets. On July 15, 1989, Milligan submitted his final report. It declared the explosion to be a deliberate act, probably committed by Hartwig. The report suggested that Hartwig had rammed the powder bags too far into the breech to activate a timing device he had secretly hidden between them. Endorsements of the report admitted the conclusion seemed incredible, but nonetheless insisted it was supported by facts and logic. One statement bluntly argued that Hartwig had the motive, the technical knowledge, and the physical position in the turret to carry out the act. Alternative explanations, such as a chemical detonator or an accidental ignition, were dismissed. Hartwig's family rejected these accusations, insisting he was neither suicidal nor homicidal. and would never have endangered his fellow sailors. Many of the victims' families also spoke out, revealing that their loved ones had repeatedly voiced concerns about inadequate training, poor safety practices, and dangerous gunfire experiments aboard Iowa long before the disaster. Journalists soon began uncovering evidence that contradicted the Navy's narrative. A Richmond Times-Dispatch reporter revealed the existence of unauthorized powder experiments, conflicts of interest within the investigative team, and widespread training deficiencies. Major outlets, including the Associated Press, ABC, the New York Times, and investigative programs like 20/20 and 60 Minutes, all questioned the Navy's findings, arguing that the service was scapegoating a dead sailor rather than confronting the institutional imbecile failures that had allowed the disaster to happen. By October, cracks in Milligan's report had grown too large to ignore. Captain Mazzulli and Operations Officer Bob Finey received only non-punitive admonitions, their records left untarnished. Gunnery officers Kissinger and Skelly were issued punitive letters and fined, but even these modest punishments were later suspended. The Navy continued to deny that safety violations or training failures aboard Iowa had played any role in the catastrophe. But the Senate Armed Services Committee announced hearings to review the investigation, signaling that the official story was already beginning to collapse. Under the weight of scrutiny, testimony began to emerge, suggesting that Clayton Hartwig was innocent, and that the Navy might have been attempting to cover up what was truly an accident. Families of the sailors, journalists, and even members of Congress began raising questions. And in March of 1990, the House Armed Services Committee released its report titled USS Iowa Tragedy, an Investigative Failure. That report delivered a stinging rebuke to the Navy, accusing it of prematurely concluding sabotage and failing to follow investigative standards. The committee noted that the initial inquiry had been riddled with gaps, inconsistencies, and a lack of impartiality, all of which contributed to the public perception that the Navy had scapegoated one man to shield itself from embarrassment and liability. With pressure mounting and public trust waning, the Navy sought outside help in the form of Sandia National Laboratories, a highly respected Department of Energy research facility with expertise in explosives and forensic analysis. Sandia assigned 40 scientists to the case, led by Richard Schwabel, who began carefully reviewing the Navy's sabotage theory. Their first step was to analyze the projectiles from all three guns of turret to in hopes of finding evidence that would clarify the cause. But when the team asked for those critical projectiles, they learned that the shells had been misplaced and could not be located. A shocking oversight that hampered progress and raised further doubts about how evidence had been handled. Despite this setback, Sandia pressed forward. They investigated historical precedents, including turret explosions aboard USS Mississippi, a New Mexico-class battleship that had served in both World Wars, believing that the accidents might reveal similarities. Yet Navy leadership quietly discouraged Sandia from pursuing that line of inquiry, with senior officers noting such discussions were unwelcome. Even so, Sandia persisted and began to dismantle the Navy's chemical igniter theory. Traces that the Navy had interpreted as remnants of an igniter were proven by Sandia to be nothing more than cleaning solution and common shipboard materials. This revelation undermined the entire foundation of the sabotage claim. From there, Sandia engineers ran simulations and tested alternative hypotheses. They discovered that the powder bags in the center gun may have been rammed farther than intended, producing abnormal compression and heat. Their models demonstrated that excessive ramming pressure could indeed cause spontaneous ignition. This finding was crucial, but the path forward was not smooth. Captain Joseph Dominic Maselli of Naval Sea Systems Command refused to authorize tests using real 16-inch powder bags, arguing such experiments were unrealistic. Some suspected that he feared the results might prove the Navy wrong. However, under increasing pressure, the Navy reluctantly agreed to conduct joint tests with Sandia in May 1990. When those tests were carried out, the results were undeniable. Over-ramming powder bags could ignite them, confirming Sandia's theory and contradicting the sabotage narrative. Despite this, The Navy did not immediately embrace the evidence. Instead, the Government Accountability Office weighed in, suggesting that given the dangerous flaws exposed in the gun operation procedures, the Iowa should even be considered for deactivation. Still, the Navy launched what it described as a second, unbiased investigation. Any hope of neutrality quickly evaporated when it was announced that Captain Mate, who had been closely tied to the sabotage theory and had resisted Sandia's efforts, would oversee the inquiry. This decision immediately cast a shadow over the new investigations. Credibility Schwabel and his team at Sandia continued to push forward. They attended new rounds of overram tests in June 1990, only to discover that Mate had deliberately kept the ramming speeds far lower than those that would have occurred during real turret operations. Sandia scientists grew increasingly frustrated, feeling the Navy was intentionally manipulating conditions to avoid further explosive results. Yet, at around 14 feet per second, even at that artificially reduced speed, a test produced a violent ignition. The implications were unmistakable. An overram could trigger an explosion. Mate, however, resisted calls for additional higher-speed testing. And when a Navy technician independently found that slower overrams could also be hazardous, Mate ordered him to stop. For Sandia, this behavior looked less like caution and more like obstruction. Schwabel escalated his concerns to higher command, demanding more comprehensive tests. His persistence succeeded. By mid-July, more rigorous testing was performed and for additional explosions were triggered, each reinforcing the overram theory beyond dispute. At that point, it was virtually impossible to deny the reality that unsafe handling, not sabotage, had likely caused the Iowa explosion. And yet, even with overwhelming evidence, the Navy pressed forward publicly as if nothing had changed. Only minor safety adjustments were announced, such as removing trim layers from powder bags, painting the rammer to prevent mistakes, and mandating additional crew training. No acknowledgement of a systemic procedural flaw was made, and no public admission of fault was offered. Then, in November 1990, investigators finally experienced a breakthrough. After months of searching, two long-missing projectiles from Turret 2's left and right guns were located in a storage warehouse in Sandia wasted no time conducting exhaustive examinations. They discovered the same microscopic iron fibers and chemical residues on those projectiles as had been found on the center gun shell, proving that the forensic evidence previously used to implicate Hartwig was not unique. Schwabel later remarked that this discovery should have ended the Navy's case against Hartwig immediately. But the Navy refused to relent. Its final report still clung to the sabotage narrative. Despite the fact that $25 million had been spent on an investigation that no longer supported such a conclusion, only in October of the following year did the Navy finally admit that it had no proof of sabotage. But even then it declined to accept the overram explanation outright. Instead, it was ordered never again to convene a single officer investigative board for cases of such magnitude. By then, the damage was done. USS Iowa was decommissioned in 1990 and placed into the reserve fleet, later to be transferred to California, where it would open as a museum in 2012. Commodore Milligan and Captain Mate both retired in 1992 with their careers intact. Despite their central roles in the flawed investigation, Milligan went on to work in academia and the insurance industry, while Mate faded into obscurity. Captain Mate retired in May 1990, using his change of command ceremony to publicly criticize the Navy's handling of the case, stating that only God knew what had truly happened. He later joined Lockheed Martin. Others did not fare as well. Ensign Don Mayer resigned in protest, openly accusing Mate and others of orchestrating a cover-up, only to have his criticisms censored from his discharge papers. Kendall Truitt, the sailor accused by rumor of having a secret affair with Hartwig, and who defended him until the very end, was denied re-enlistment, a move widely seen as retaliation. He nevertheless vowed to give Hartwig's life insurance payout to his family. Meanwhile, Hartwig's own reputation was destroyed. In 1991, his family filed suit against the Navy under the Federal Tort Claims Act, alleging emotional distress. The case survived attempts to dismiss it, but was ultimately thrown out in 1999, as sovereign immunity barred defamation claims. The family also pursued a $10 million lawsuit against NBC News, arguing that its reporting, based largely on Navy leaks, had falsely portrayed Hartwig as unstable, violent, and suicidal. NBC denied wrongdoing, insisting it merely reported information provided by official sources. A federal judge agreed and dismissed the case. In the end, 47 sailors were killed in the turret explosion. Hartwig's name was blackened beyond repair, and the truths that mishandling of powder bags likely caused the tragedy was effectively buried under layers of bureaucracy, denial, and institutional support. The Navy had fought bitterly to preserve its story until the very end, even as mounting evidence contradicted it. Today, a memorial at Iowa Point honors those lost in the explosion, but no plaque or monument can undo the devastation suffered by the families or restore the reputation of the sailor wrongfully blamed for one of the Navy's darkest peacetime disasters. Asterisk.